Hey folks, welcome back to EVO Gimbals. Today we are talking about the new GoPro Hero7 Black and its new TimeWarp feature. We're going to be comparing the TimeWarp to the photo time lapses. We're also going to be comparing it handheld versus when it's mounted onto a gimbal. Now, if you haven't seen it already, go check out our video where we talk about the hyper smooth stabilization that is added to GoPro videos in certain modes. We've done a pretty thorough analysis on that, and you can check that video out. This is going to be all about messing with time and the TimeWarp and photo time-lapse features. So let's get right into it. So while testing out the TimeWarp feature and the time-lapse feature, what I really wanted to get down to was the issue of quality. I think that there's a lot of confusion out there with the TimeWarp feature. It's kind of filming this hyperlapse style video for you, and it's not quite true. Just to give you an idea, this is a hyperlapse that I shot in town here. I shot this on a tripod with my Canon 6D. The whole shoot, that took an hour just to shoot those photos, trying to be as precise as possible, keeping the main point of focus in the same part of the frame the whole time. And then I had to come back and to post-process all those images. Took about 2 hours before I really had something that I was happy with. So you're talking about a 3-hour workflow for 3 seconds of usable video. Whereas with the GoPro, you can turn on the TimeWarp mode and you can have something that, while it doesn't have the same look and feel as a traditional hyperlapse, you definitely get the point across. It can definitely add an exciting element to the story you're trying to tell, and is also a really unique complement to a lot of the other features that come in this camera. So after all this testing, I'll give you the verdict right out. To get the best image out of the TimeWarp feature, you're gonna want TimeWarp on, and you're gonna want this thing on a gimbal. Now, I've tested it in this video here. This is TimeWarp handheld without a gimbal. And as you can see, it's pretty good. It's definitely better than past versions. If I was to just shoot a photo time lapse and go walk with it handheld, it's smoother than that, but it's still not perfect. It's not very smooth. Now, this video I went out and shot, and this is the TimeWarp feature while it's mounted on a gimbal. I believe this was about 10x. So while I do think the TimeWarp feature is very solid, I don't necessarily think it's as solid as advertised. I do think you are going to want to use a gimbal if you really want to get the best performance out of this mode. Another point of interest for me in this test was really trying to compare the TimeWarp, which is essentially a time-lapse video, versus photo, or a traditional time-lapse, which the GoPro can also shoot. A GoPro has multiple time-lapse modes, so you have TimeWarp, you have video time-lapse, you have photo time-lapse, and then you have night-lapse. So with the photo time-lapse, the one advantage you have when shooting photos is that you can shoot RAW on the GoPro. The caveat to that is that when you're shooting RAW, you have to be shooting at either a 5-second or longer interval to unlock the RAW feature in the camera. Now, shooting RAW has some advantages. It allows you to manipulate the image much more in post than you would be able to, for example, with a video time lapse. But you definitely want to be shooting a much longer scene, something like the sunrise or sunset, or in a spot where the camera is going to be set up shooting something for a long period of time. What I noticed, the biggest difference between the TimeWarp feature and the traditional photo time lapse, is that while with the photo time lapse, even if you're not shooting RAW, even if you're shooting at 2-second intervals like I was in this video here, or you're shooting at 1-second intervals like I was in this video here, the image does appear to be a little sharper. Now with these videos, I didn't do anything to adjust the image in post. I just loaded the photos into Lightroom, exported them into a program I use called LR Time-Lapse, and that stitched together the time-lapse for me, and it didn't do anything to the image in terms of color correction. So you can see that the difference between the photo time-lapse and the video time-lapse is, I think you get a slightly crisper, sharper image with the photo time-lapse than you do with the TimeWarp feature. Now, however, I do think that the TimeWarp feature, especially if you're doing something where you're moving, which is really the purpose of it, I do think it's better overall, even if you're using a gimbal for the photo time lapse. The TimeWarp especially when it's on a gimbal, is just smoother. It just comes out, it has kind of that, more of that kind of floating, breezing effect where the camera is level the whole time. Now, a major limitation of both the TimeWarp feature and the time-lapse feature, whether you're shooting time-lapse video or photo time-lapses with the GoPro, is that the GoPro doesn't allow you to modify the ProTune settings in a lot of ways. So for example, it's really nice sometimes when you're shooting a time-lapse to get motion blur. And typically how you would do that is you would lower the shutter rate to, you know, whatever is appropriate for that scene. If you're walking, you'd lower it quite a bit. And then you can traditionally use either controls on the camera or things like an ND filter and kind of control light that way. Well, with the GoPro, you can't really do that. You kind of have to guess, you have to do some experimenting, you have to see what works. And for some of these time lapses and time warp videos, I was going out and using some Polar Pro ND filters. I believe for this one and this one and this one, I had the ND16 on there, which is kind of middle of the road ND filter, pretty dark, but it definitely, I feel like, degraded the image quality. I was really trying to get more motion blur, and I think instead I just came out with a grainier, not as crisp looking image. So the other thing to take into consideration when shooting a photo time lapse is that if you're shooting RAW in particular, or in any of the other photo modes, is that the GoPro is gonna output images in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Because it's using all of the sensor to capture that image, it outputs a 4:3, that's the size of the sensor, that's the aspect ratio of the sensor, similar to if you were shooting 4:3 in one of the high resolution modes like 4K, 4:3 at 24 frames a second. You get the same thing, you get a much larger image, you're using the whole sensor, and you can see this chart here kind of breaks down what the actual different resolutions, how much of the sensor they use. And you can see that you get this 4:3 image, which is nice that you get that much information, but then you bring it into an editor and you see that you either have to crop into it, which kind of reduces the whole advantage of shooting raw photos to get a crisper, more clear image, or you have to do some sort of dynamic stretching. So you can see here, this is what the output was. It's a square 4:3 video. Looks pretty good. I mean, I'm happy with how it turned out, but it's hard to incorporate that into a video. Now I can crop it in, so I'm basically cutting off a significant portion of the top and bottom of the image, and then I can kind of, you know, focus on what section of the image I really want to, but you're sacrificing resolution when you do that. So what I've done is, and what I typically do for video, and I treat these time lapses the same way because they are video once they're all processed, is I will use a third-party extension called Andy's Elastic Aspect, and that allows me to dynamically stretch a 4:3 video to fit in a 16:9 frame. The one thing you do get is you get some distortion on the edges that can be pretty significant at times. But you want to take that into consideration, that your images will not pop out at a 16:9 aspect ratio, so it's going to require a little bit more post-processing. And generally speaking, with the photo time lapses, there's just more processing involved, which makes a strong argument for the time warp feature. I really think that the time warp feature is great for any time you're walking with the gimbal, where you're not shooting any particularly super long scenes, because you can only go up to 30x in terms of time. So I think the time warp feature is a nice addition. So let's talk about how I shot some of these time lapses. So what I used was the EVO SS wearable gimbal. It was kind of awesome. I have a counterweight on here to kind of balance out the Hero7. It worked great, really like seamless, super smooth. I used it in conjunction with the handle that comes with every SS in the box, and the extension handle gets really long and works great. You can lock it down, and then I had this all connected to our FlexiPod here. The FlexiPod, I screwed it into the 1/4-20 on the bottom of the handle. That way I could set it down whenever I wanted to. I could also take the handle off and screw the FlexiPod directly on to the EVO SS. And what this allowed me to do was to get some really unique moving time lapses. Because the EVO SS can connect to our apps, it allows us to do motion time lapse, which is really cool. So I use the flex pod on the bottom of the SS, and I put it in some interesting spots, as you can see here, and I set it up for some moving time lapses. Probably could have done some longer ones, but just was testing it out, seeing how it was going, and I really enjoyed it. The advantages of this FlexiPod are so numerous. I mean, you can really put this thing anywhere and it will stay put, super grippy, super malleable legs, and really gives you a whole lot of options for how you want to mount your gimbal and your camera. If you want to, if there's a spot where you're looking, I don't know how I could ever really shoot that. Well, you have the gimbal, which is going to keep the camera level. Tripod's out, you don't need that. And then you have these legs, which can be manipulated, and you can really just kind of, do your thing wherever you want, really. So let us know what you think. Leave any questions or comments that you have in the comments section. Please subscribe if you haven't done that already. We want to keep making these videos for you, so let us know if there's a video you want to see, and we'll get out there and we'll get it done. Have a great holiday, and remember to keep it smooth.